Ladies and gentlemen, we present at this time the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan. After you listen to the address by Father Coughlin, you're invited to write your comments to WHBI, Newark, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, Father Coughlin will address you today on the subject, not anti-Semitism, but anti-communism. Hundreds of thousands of persons have requested copies of his last two addresses. During the past week, criticism of these addresses have occupied much space in the press. These will be answered today. Hundreds of thousands of persons in this audience will be anxious to have a copy of the address about to be delivered in order to read it carefully and analytically. Copies of these can be had by writing directly to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan. Before Father Coughlin comes to the microphone, the Shrine of the Little Flower Choristers, by transcription and conducted by Emil Cote at New York, with Mr. Cyril Guthrell before me at the console of the organ, will sing Schubert's Ave Maria. Approximately 4½ minutes will be occupied with this singing. During these 4½ minutes, each one of you has time to telephone at least one friend or family to listen in to this most important and courageous address. Please go to the telephone and invite some friend to join you in this audience. Schubert's Ave Maria. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Father Charles E. Coughlin from the Shrine of the Little Flower at Royal Oak, Michigan, in his address, Not Anti-Semitism, but Anti-communism. Copies of this address can be had if you will write a letter to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak this week. Father Coughlin.
Good afternoon, my friends. 2 weeks ago, the minds of our American citizens were focused upon the latest outburst of Nazi persecution directed against the Jews of Germany. Every newspaper heralded abroad the news of a $400 million fine imposed upon 600,000 German Jews by a government which already had restricted the liberties of Catholic and Protestant and Jew. A government which, thanks be to God, has not resorted officially to the guillotine, the machine gun, or the kerosene-drenched pit. This was the first time our apathetic generation was aroused to the cries of distress which were sounding upon heedless ears since 1917. This magnificent publicity was regarded as a rainbow of hope which filtered through the dark clouds of despair. Recognizing it as such, I seized the opportunity to raise my voice not only in condemnation of this latest manifestation of persecution, but to amalgamate the forces of a sympathetic world against all persecution, be it that of Catholic or Protestant, Jew or Gentile. Surely, thought I, these barbaric outbursts against race or creed must be traceable to some common origin. Surely a chastened world must be willing to sacrifice its selfish, racial, and nationalistic objectives to militate against the common cause of all the afflictions experienced by all our fellow men resident abroad. Without attempting to minimize the atrocities of Nazism, I drew to the attention of this audience the excesses of communism. I insisted that Nazism was only a defense mechanism against communism. To an intelligent audience composed of intelligent Christians and intelligent Jews, I appealed. Let us distill our sympathies not only from the tears of the oppressed Jews, but also from the lifeblood of 20 million Christians. That was my prayer. Let us attack communism and destroy it from the face of the earth. If we are scientific in our approach to the whole problem of persecution, for causes must be removed before effects can be destroyed. That was my counsel. For having made this appeal, for having suggested this counsel, for having pointed out that atheistic Jews were too prominent in furthering the cause of Lenin and Trotsky with its religion of atheism, its patriotism of internationalism, and its security of confiscation, I was most unexpectedly assailed by those who characterized my address as a defense of Nazism and as an expression of anti-Semitism. Of these misunderstandings I tried to dispose last Sunday when I produced the previous Sunday's broadcast by transcription. Unfortunately, those who seemingly reject both my pleas and my counsels, and whose official, organized silence towards communism manifests a most alarming situation, unfortunately, they have not seen fit to meet my challenge of distilling their sympathy both from the tears of Jews and the blood of Christians. Instead, They have intentionally dodged the issue by endeavoring to confuse the public mind, particularly through the use of managed editorials and mismanaged interviews. For emphasis, let me repeat that the controlled press has failed to face the issue which I presented. Would not a dispassionate judge be inclined then to conclude that the effort on the part of my critics to assail my person and scoff at my presentation of facts, would he not conclude that this is related to their desire to protect communism? My friends, there would be no warrant for my continuing to occupy your attention with further argumentation on this subject had the press inaugurated an honest effort to arouse sympathy against the atrocities of communism as well as against the injustices of Nazism. But the press has failed. Therefore, in loyalty to my fellow Christians, I in turn am challenged to pursue my course. Permit me first to restate the underlying principle which is associated with persecution. To remove all persecution from the world, persecution both of Jew and of Christian, it is necessary first to consolidate the fair-minded support of all fair-minded citizens, Jew and Gentile. To organize successfully public opinion against not only Nazism, which no sensible American Christian can logically support, but also against communism, which no religious Jew can honestly sustain, we must have as our objective social justice for all. Social justice whose principles are founded upon the teachings of Jesus Christ. Since then, there is a weapon which my adversaries choose. I am constrained to continue my battle. I must lift up the shield of defense against false assertion. I must use the sword of factual truth to oppose them, lest my silence be interpreted as surrender, and lest such a surrender be regarded as a victory for the anti-Nazis over those whose battle cry is anti-Nazi and anti-communist and anti-injustice with Christ over all. Therefore, this afternoon, I will pursue my case by considering the arguments presented by my critics last week to sustain their untenable position of silence regarding Christian persecution. My opponents' arguments are classified first in the editorials of certain newspapers, second in the arguments of Alexander Karensky and Leon Trotsky, third in the publicized statements made by Kuhn-Loeb Company, fourth in the statement attributed to the office of the American Secret Service. As to the newspapers and their adverse editorials of the past week, do you recollect the complaint which I uttered 2 Sundays ago? On that occasion, I expressed the thought that when millions of Christians in Russia, Mexico, and Spain were made targets of the machine gun, little or no publicity was given by the public press to these persecutions, which future generations will regard as the worst atrocities of all time. Then there was a silent press. Then there was a venal press that eulogized those responsible for establishing a policy of recognizing Russia. Then there was a calloused press that belittled the grief of Spain and Mexico. Although many newspapers have not taken a position of hands off the communist question and hands off those whose silence supports it, yet a powerful group of papers practically have adopted that attitude. They gloss over our recognition of Russia. They applaud when congratulations are cabled to the haters of Christ. They vacillate between the Spanish loyalists and rebels. They praise the liberalism of Mexico. And why? You ask me why? Oh, do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Or can the fig tree, my brethren, bear grapes or the vine figs? It is not in a spirit of retaliation that I remind you of these things, for you know that the editorial content of many papers is colored by the logic of the advertising dollar. The advertising dollar which manages editorials. Nor is it in the spirit of revenge that I use the following concrete example to prove the viciousness of an inspired press whose editorials and news articles manifest a serious lack of responsibility and honesty. But in a spirit of truth and of courage to defend truth, I dare to unfold for you the following concrete story of a typical controlled newspaper. A story where those, or their representatives who control the advertising dollar, control the freedom of the press. Last week, Rabbi Leo M. Franklin of Temple Bethel, Detroit, Michigan, sought an interview with Mr. Henry Ford to discuss with him, among other things, the possibility of the Ford organizations engaging the services of certain refugee Jews whom the rabbi expected to be expelled from Germany. In the presence of Mr. Ford and his executives, this matter was discussed at some length. A resume of Mr. Ford's conversation was written by the rabbi. Confessedly, it was the rabbi's composition, not Mr. Ford's. It was the rabbi's concept of not what Mr. Ford actually said, but what Rabbi Franklin would prefer he had said. Following this meeting, the Detroit Free Press printed a purported first-person interview with Mr. Henry Ford. It was captioned by front-page headlines which read, quotations, "Ford assails Nazis, persecutions, and welcomes Jewish refugees as valuable addition to U.S. life." In a statement severely critical of the Nazi persecution of the Jews, continues the Free Press, Henry Ford Wednesday night declared that he favored the admission of persecuted Jews to this country under the selective quota system, unquote. The purported interview, quoting Mr. Ford and carried in all the newspapers at home and abroad, this purported interview, quoting Mr. Ford in the first person singular throughout, was not given by Mr. Ford. The interview which the Detroit Free Press said was given out at Dearborn, Michigan on Wednesday of last week was not given out by Mr. Ford or by any of his executives on Wednesday night or at any other time. Here, my friends, was a gigantic attempt to put into the mouth of America's foremost manufacturer words that he did not say. To my mind, a new low in editorial responsibility, a mark seldom equaled in the history of American journalism, was attained. Social Justice magazine, distrustful of the purported interview carried in the Detroit Free Press of December 1st relative to Nazi persecution, sent its investigators to ascertain the facts of the case. Mr. Harry Bennett, speaking officially for the Ford Motor Corporation, and in the presence of Mr. Henry Ford, the same Harry Bennett who arranged the meeting between Rabbi Franklin and Mr. Ford, permits Social Justice magazine to say the following in a signed statement. Quotation. 1. The direct quotation carried in the paper is totally inaccurate and was not written by Mr. Ford but was composed by Rabbi Franklin. 2. Rabbi Franklin came to see Mr. Ford to ask him if his factory would assimilate Jewish refugees, the result of Nazi persecution. Mr. Ford said that he believed there was little or no persecution in Germany. If any, it was due not to the German government, but to the warmongers, the international bankers. Moreover, while Mr. Ford expressed his humanitarianism for all people, yet he believed that Jews wouldn't be content to work in factories. That was the essence of the talk between Mr. Ford and Rabbi Franklin. But the story handed to the Free Press was written by Rabbi Franklin and handed to it by Rabbi Franklin and not by Mr. Ford. Unquote the signed statement. Ladies and gentlemen, the above quotation from an article which will appear in Social Justice magazine on this travesty in journalism is authentic. There, then, is a sample of inspired news of a controlled newspaper dispensing for public reading as if it were a direct statement composed by Mr. Ford himself. For what purpose, I ask? Possibly for the same purpose and subject to the same influences. When some newspapers find it profitable to adopt a policy of silence on Christian persecution abroad, they are willing to headline the $400 million fine levied against 600,000 Jews day after day. Oh, by their fruits, these news journals shall be known. However, after the deluge of last week's editorial tidal wave, whose origin we now know, I was expected to feel pretty much as Mark Twain did. Mark Twain, who related in his memoirs his experience, which he had as an editor in Virginia City, Nevada. As well as I recollect, the humorist said, seated in my editor's chair one day, I was confronted by the gargantuan figure of a man I had abused in an editorial a few days before. He glowered at me. I knew I was in for it. But as always, my native resourcefulness pulled me through. As the giant advanced on me, I stood up. He charged. Cleverly, I contrived to get his arm around my waist and his elbow under my chin. We wrestled about for a moment, and I succeeded in keeping my feet high in the air. We fell to the floor. Again, my resourcefulness asserted itself. For by a deft movement, I got his knee in my stomach, and his fingers tight about my throat. Then I had him. My friends, next permit me to analyze and refute the statements publicized by Mr. Karensky and Mr. Trotsky. Alexander Karensky, one of the chief witnesses whose testimony is supposed to stultify my plea to oppose communism together with Nazism, a witness whose contribution was intended to confuse the public mind, is not well known to the younger generation. Mr. Karensky was prominent for a period of 7 months in 1917. He was the leader of the first of 3 Russian revolutions. Most men of our generation believe that he had gone to the happy hunting ground of lost causes. Presupposing that the American public had forgotten the 3 Russian revolutions since 1917, presupposing that the public mind entertains the error that there was only 1 Russian revolution since that date, Mr. Karensky arises from the tomb of the past to remind us that he fathered the revolution, which for shortness of life and insignificance of effect will be classified with the frequent uprisings which come and go with every sunset in Central America. As a matter of record, Mr. Karensky's revolution came in like a lion in the windy month of March 1917 and left the stage of this troubled world like a lamb in October of that same year. Contrary to common opinion, Mr. Karensky did not successfully annihilate Tsarism. On the contrary, it was the guns and bayonets of the Trotskyites and Leninites that accomplished that in July 1918. They of the Second Revolution, who succeeded in overthrowing the Kerensky government. The First Revolution was devoid of atheistic Jewish domination, and for that reason, possibly, was a failure. It lasted only 7 months. But the Second Russian Revolution, which, for the sake of clarity, we now refer to as the Trotsky Russian Revolution, this one not only drove Alexander Kerensky as a wanderer over the face of the earth, not only murdered the Tsar and his family in 1918, but inaugurated the mass murder of 20,400,000 Christians. That was the real Russian Revolution with its dictator, its subjugation of 160 million people, its pogroms against Christians, its professed atheism, and its advertised internationalism. Mr. Kerensky, the father of the first assault against the injustices of Tsarism, practically vanished from the headlines in 1917. But on this, the occasion of his reappearance, I welcome the opportunity to agree with him heartily that the Jews had only an insignificant part in his failure. I agree with him that after he fled Russia ignominiously with the coming of the Lenins and Trotskys in October 1917, I agree with him wholeheartedly that the Jews who were successful in establishing communism over the stillborn corpse of his socialistic effort, that these were apostate Jews, as he calls them, or atheistic Jews, as I term them. On one important point, I do not agree with the testimony given by this revolutionary, a testimony which was accredited extensive space in all the important news journals of America. This witness said, according to the Detroit News, November 30th, quotes, "The suggestion is ridiculous that the Jews financed the revolution," unquote. He should have qualified his statement by saying, "my revolution." He continues by stating that, quotations, "the revolutionary government obtained credits not through any bankers, Jewish or Gentile, in America, but from the United States government," unquote. I say that according to reputable testimony, it was financed by Jacob Schiff. Remembering that we are discussing the first Russian Revolution, which flourished only from the spring until the autumn of 1917, let me be of assistance to the failing memory of this witness by quoting the New York Times of March 24, 1917, a photostatic copy of which I have before me. On that date, this newspaper said, quotations, "The movement," referring to the Karensky Revolution, "the movement was financed by a New York banker you all know and love," quoting Mr. Kennan and referring to Mr. Jacob Schiff. Following this statement, made by one of the then leading foreign correspondents, Mr. Kennan, the New York Times informs us that a Mr. Parsons arose on the platform of Carnegie Hall and said, quotations, "I will now read a message from White Sulphur Springs sent by the gentleman to whom Mr. Kennan referred," unquote. A portion of the message reads as follows, quotation, "Will you say for me to those present at tonight's meeting how deeply I regret my inability to celebrate with the friends of Russian freedom the actual reward of what we had hoped and striven for these long years." Signed, Jacob H. Schiff. To confirm my contention that Mr. Jacob Schiff contributed to the activities of the Karensky Revolution, let me quote the Jewish Communal Register of New York City, 1917-18, edited and published by the Coughlin, the Jewish community, of New York City. I speak these words, certainly holding no brief for Germany or for Nazism. Simply as a student of history, I am endeavoring to analyze the reason for the growth of the idea in the minds of the Nazi Party that communism and Judaism were too closely woven for the national health of Germany. Nor do I speak these words to defend the atheistic international Jews and Gentiles throughout the world who follow the footsteps of Lenin and advocate the principles of Marx. I do ask, however, that an insane world will distinguish between the innocent Jew and the guilty Jew, as much as I would ask the same insane world to distinguish between the innocent Gentile and the guilty Gentile. Believe me, my friends, it is in all charity that I speak these words as I seek to discover the causes that produce the effect known as Nazism. Nazism, which was evolved to act as a defense mechanism against the incursions of communism. Let us not forget the object of this discussion. My purpose is to contribute a worthwhile suggestion to eradicate from this world its mania for persecution. Thus, while we are concerned with destroying the causes which beget persecution from this civilization of ours, let us profit at this occasion when the attention of our country has been called to this international immorality, particularly on the occasion of a $400 million fine being levied against 600,000 Jews. I ask you, should not all good men, Jew and Gentile, Catholic and Protestant, Christian and non-Christian, should not all good men coordinate their forces to restore sanity, peace, and justice to an era which, for its ferocity, its barbarism, and its hatred, has outstripped the Diocletians, the Neros, and the Torquemadas of old? I was thrilled to hear the most intellectual Archbishop of San Francisco remind his compatriots that this universal surge of sympathy whose waters are now about to wash clean the impure emotions of a materialistic America, I was thrilled, and so were you, to hear him state that at long last the press and the radio of this nation are beginning to play their part in arousing a dormant people to the other injustices and persecutions which are besmirching our civilization. The persecutions in Russia, in Mexico, and in Spain. Persecution is an injustice wherever it exists. Today's persecution was born from the loins of yesterday's persecution. Thus, if Nazism, a persecutor of Jew and Catholic and Protestant, if Nazism is a defense mechanism against communism, be assured that communism, another persecutor, was a defense mechanism against the greed of the money changers who persecuted and pilloried the teeming populations of Europe. Permit me to restate that important principle. If Nazism is now memorable for its injustice and its persecution, so was communism. And so was the economic system which made slaves of millions in the midst of plenty, the system which generated communism. Thus, one persecution begets another as one injustice evolves into another. The inevitability of cause and effect will pursue its course to its logical destiny of chaos as one injustice continues to reproduce a worse injustice. It is our concern, therefore, to destroy the cause in order to prevent a succession of disastrous effects. To abolish persecution, let us destroy hatred. To eliminate hatred, let us establish justice. Justice for all without exception. Any other approach to our problem is unscientific. And may I add, there can be no justice without God. There can be no God without love. Love for him and for our fellow men whom he fashioned according to his image and likeness. Be not mistaken, therefore, in analyzing the cause of Nazism. Trace it courageously to its legitimate lair, to its occasioning cause. Therefore, I say to the good Jews of America, be not indulgent with the irreligious atheistic Jews and Gentiles who promote the cause of persecution in the land of the communists, the same ones who promote the cause of atheism in America. Be not lenient with your high financiers and politicians who assisted at the birth of the only political, social, and economic system in all civilization that adopted atheism as its religion, internationalism as its patriotism, and slavery as its liberty. In our possession, we have a copy of the official white paper issued by the English War Cabinet in 1919. This official paper prints the names of the Jewish bankers Kuhn, Loeb and Company of New York among those who helped to finance the Russian Revolution and communism. Since then, both Jewish and Gentile financiers have been according financial comfort to the Soviet Republic. Perhaps these financial overtures were made in innocence. Perhaps not. Moreover, I have before me a quotation from the periodical named The American Hebrew of September 10, 1920, which says, quotation, "The achievement, the Russian Jewish Revolution, destined to figure in history as the overshadowing result of the World War, was largely the outcome of Jewish thinking, of Jewish discontent, of Jewish effort to reconstruct." Unquote. Let our remarks be couched in the language of charity when referring to that quotation. It was a Jewish effort to reconstruct. But in justice, we expect that results, that truth founded upon fact and experience, now will convince all Jewish leaders worthy of the name to repudiate vigorously atheistic communism and its followers whence emerges the fanged serpent of persecution. Then and only then can we coordinate our forces to banish hatred and injustice from the nations of the world. Now that experience has proven that this effort to reconstruct society by means of communism died a-borning, now that the same experience teaches us that from the birth cradle of communism there rose the stench of Nazi persecution, now that this communism is permeating the entire world with the fumes of hate, of destruction, and of irreligion, is it not time for those Jews and Christians who have escaped unscathed to repurify the atmosphere of the world, first from communism, lest by its continued presence an unjust defense mechanism similar to Nazism will spring up to assail us? Thus it is my hope that the thousands of erudite, sincere Jews in this nation, together with all informed Christians, will recognize that as long as misguided Jews and Gentiles both, and in such great numbers, continue to propagate the doctrines of anti-God, anti-Christ, anti-patriotism, and anti-property, so long there will always exist some defensive mechanism against communism. Today, it is Nazism in Berlin. Tomorrow, it will be some otherism in New York. But always, it will be characterized by persecution. It would be ignominious for Christians at this hour to cloak themselves in the garments of class silence on the subject of Nazism or communism, the latter from which cesspool there originated Nazism. And it would be ignoble for us to raise our voice in defense of persecution and not to raise our voice to defend the 600,000 Jews of Germany. However, it is my opinion that Nazism, the effect of communism, cannot be liquidated in its persecution complex until the religious Jews in high places, in synagogue and finance, radio and press, attack the cause, attack its forthright, and the errors and the spread of communism, together with all our co-nationals who support it. My fellow citizens, I am not ignorant of Jewish history. I know its glories. I am acquainted with its glorious sons. I am aware of the keen intellectuality which has characterized its progress in commerce, in finance, in all the arts and sciences, and particularly in the field of communication. But I am also aware that every nation from time immemorial has lifted in its hand the lash of persecution to strike the back of Jewry. From Nineveh to Berlin, from ancient to modern times, a constant moan of suffering has been raised from the weeping wall whose structure now has encompassed the entire world. Portugal and Spain, France and Germany, England and the northern countries, Italy and Russia, all in turn have taken their stand at the pillar of persecution to wield the leaden lash about the shoulders of Jews. For what reason, I need not detail at this moment. I will satisfy myself simply by drawing to your attention that since the time of Christ, Jewish persecution only followed after Christians were first persecuted. Persecuted either by exploiters within their own ranks, as in the Middle Ages, or by the enemies from without, as in our own day. Many historians, in fact a vast majority of them, maintain that the Jews were persecuted because of their social philosophy. And parallel with their persecution has been the persecution of Christians, not for their social philosophy, as historians point out, but for their religion. Relative to Christian persecution in our day, in this most enlightened day of the 20th century, witness the price that Christians have paid to uphold their religion against those who were anti-religious, to uphold their Christ against those who were anti-Christ, to uphold their patriotism, their nationalism, against those who were unpatriotic and international. Between the years 1917 and 38, more than 20 million Christians were murdered by the communistic government in Russia. Between these same years, not $400 million, but $40 billion at a conservative estimate of Christian property was appropriated by the Lenins and Trotskys, the Zinovievs and the Kamenets, the Litvinovs and the Lipinskys, by the atheistic Jews and Gentiles both of Russia. Those were the desperate days when Christians were not expelled from their native land. Oh, no, they were targets for the machine gun which beat out its tattoo against human hearts. Incredible days when the altars of Christ were desecrated and the servants of Christ were massacred on ever-multiplying Calvary. Our president recently said, such news from any part of the world, speaking of the persecution of the Jews in Germany, such news would inevitably produce a similar profound reaction among American people in every part of the nation. Alas, the news of Christian persecution came to our shores. Alas, the press and the radio were almost silent. Alas, this present government made friends of these murderers by recognizing their flags. Those were the days when there was silence in the press, days when there was silence on the radio, because opposition to communism was a controversial subject. Turn the pages of history to recent years, when the disciples of the communists, atheists, and internationalists, and anti-Christians obtruded their philosophy into Mexico. Although the Christian world stood aghast, while hundreds of millions of dollars of property, including ecclesiastical institutions, were confiscated. There was no condemnation officially uttered against the Cardinal. There was no recall of the ambassador Josephus Daniels. There was no national protest on that occasion, and there was no invitation extended to the persecuted Christians of Mexico to seek refuge in our land. Almost contemporaneous with this Mexican madness, directed and operated by the commissars of the Kremlin, the world began to hear the story of a disconsolate Spain. Spain that has become the battleground of communism versus Christianity. What is the record of that unfortunate country? 700,000 men have fallen in battle. 300,000 of the noblest non-combatants, men and women and children, have been butchered because of their religion. The press of America succeeded in the meantime in muzzling the truth about these horrors. No symposium of radio protest was organized to decry the Christian lifeblood spilled upon the pavements of Barcelona. Barcelona, with its population of over 1 million persons, where at this moment there is left open only one small, semi-official chapel. Nor with flat bowels our Spanish ambassador called back to Washington to tell his story, the most ghastly story in all the pages of civilized or uncivilized history. Nor did our State Department forbid the 3,200 members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, recruited from the Jewish and Gentile communist youth, from participating in once more dragging Christ down from his cross and slaughtering his innocent followers. And most recently, why, then I ask, was there this silence on the radio and in the press? Ask the gentlemen who control the three national radio chains. Ask those who dominate the destinies of the financially inspired press. Surely these Jewish gentlemen and others must have been ignorant of the facts of Russia, Mexico, and Spain, or they would have had a symposium in those dark days, especially when students of history recognize that Nazism is only a defense mechanism against communism, and especially the persecution of the Christian always begets persecution of the Jew. However, let the dead past bury its dead. Today, this is our day, Christians and Jews. We were not responsible for the atrocities of yesteryear. We will be responsible for the persecutions of future years. My friends, unless all persecution is stopped, unless all the causes that lead to persecution are removed, this 20th century, which will have become renowned in the chronicles of the world as the most bloodthirsty period in all its existence, will continue to procreate scientists who in turn will beget new means for destruction, to generate radicals who will conceive new plans for revolution, and to multiply persecution, unless we have courage to remove the basic causes of exploitation which have been busied confiscating the properties of the poor. Therefore, we are in hearty accord with our government, which has seen fit to recall its ambassador from Germany for the purpose of discussing the injustices of a government which has been challenged for persecuting the Jews. But if we are sincere, we will not stop there. We will recall the ambassadors or ministers from the communist countries, from Mexico City, where a price is still placed on the head of a priest, from Barcelona, in whose suburbs 300 innocent nuns, the breath of life still in their bodies, were drenched with kerosene and burnt alive by official order of the military communists, and from Moscow, where our temples have been turned into museums, and where our Christ has been crucified anew. Yes, 20 million times anew. By all means, then, let us have a convention of ambassadors. By all means, let us have courage to compound our sympathy, not only from the tears of Jews, but also from the blood of Christians. 600,000 Jews whom no government official in Germany has yet sentenced to death, and 25 million Christians at least whose lives have been snuffed out, whose property has been confiscated in its entirety, and whose altars in Christ have been desecrated since 1917 without official protest from America. America that has extended and still extends the right hand of recognition to the murderers themselves. Let us distill this sympathy into a program of peace. Peace the result of order, order the offspring of law, and law the child of justice. Thanks be to God, both the radio and the press at length have become attuned to the wails of sorrow arising from Jewish persecution. May these notes rise in a rapid crescendo until a symphony not of hate, but of love, not of protest, but of determination, fills the heart of every human being in America. May every honest Jew, every God-fearing Jew, as well as every honest and God-fearing Christian, find themselves cooperating in this common objective. This address is certainly displeasing to communists. I am reliably informed that they have organized to complain to the radio station because I have traced Nazism to the lair of communism. But Gentiles must repudiate the excesses of Nazism. Jew and Gentile both must repudiate the existence of communism from which Nazism springs. In conclusion, may we Americans not engage in unreasonable reprisals against any nation. Let charity be the norm of our conduct, and let justice for all be our guiding star.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of the transcription which brought you my recorded voice. Speaking to you directly through the microphone, I now address you, the judge and jury. But before the presentation of my case is completed, let me offer rebuttal to the charges issued by Professor Smirtinko. It is regrettable that I am forced to read into the record a part of a closely guarded, certified document. I trusted that I should be spared doing this in order to avoid personalities. However, since I am forced to defend myself not for myself, but for the cause I uphold, let me introduce into court as my witness the scholarly Professor Dennis Fahey, one of the most outstanding scholars in Ireland, professor of philosophy at Blackrock Seminary, Dublin. He says on page 88 in The Mystical Body of Christ in the Modern World the following quotations. The chief document treating of the financing of the Russian Revolution is the one drawn up by the American Secret Service and transmitted by the French High Commissioner to his government. It was published by the Documentation Catholique of Paris on March 6, 1920, and preceded by the following remarks, namely, the authenticity of this document is guaranteed to us with regard to its exactness and the exactness of the information which it contains. The American Secret Service takes responsibility. Now, in Section 1 of this official report, we read, it was found out that the following persons, as well as the banking house mentioned, were engaged in this work of destruction. Jacob Schiff, Guggenheim, Max Breitun, Coughlin, Loeb and Company, of which the following are the directors. Jacob Schiff, Felix Warburg, Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff, S.H. Hanauer, all Jews. There can be no doubt that the Russian Revolution, which broke out a year after the information given above had been received, was launched and fomented by distinctively Jewish influence. On page 90 of this same book, Father Fahey brings out the point in Section 3 of this American Secret Service report that the real name of Lapinski is Lowensohn, and that the 56 out of 59 members of this quasi-cabinet were Jews. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, I submit evidence which cannot be gainsaid easily by Professor Smirtinko, the professional anti-Nazi whose source of information was an expurgated edition of the British White Paper, an edition from which the parts which I quoted to you just now were deleted, as every honest student in history knows. As for the quotation I used last Sunday from the American Hebrew magazine, I still stand by it. Any child can verify it in any well-organized library. My appeal is nearly completed. In review, may I submit that the plaintiffs in the case are my critics. The charges that I have been guilty of un-Americanism, that I've been a supporter of Nazism, that I've been a spreader of anti-Semitism, and that I'm guilty of sadism What have they with which to substantiate them? All false witnesses once before swore in Pilate's hall. Appreciating that the majority of Americans had not heard last Sunday's discourse, these witnesses held it abroad the charge that I named Stalin and Lenin as Jews. Now you know that I did not make such statements. They scoffed at me for having broadcast that 30 million Christians had been murdered when your own ears tell you I said 20 million in one place and 25 million for all the world. Before you I stand as the defendant. I rest my case on the internal evidence of the faithful recording of last Sunday's address. I ask you to weigh the evidence carefully. In conclusion, may I refer to the American Jewish Congress recently held in New York last October. Speaking of this group representing the Jews of the United States of America, the New York Times of October 31st has the following excerpt, quotations. The mention of communism threw this convention into an uproar when delegates and visitors attempted to shout down Abraham Levine of St. Louis, a delegate who demanded that a proposed declaration of the convention's principle be amended to include a denunciation of communistic theories. After heated discussion, Mr. Levine withdrew his demand, unquote the Times. There is evidence that Jewry is silent on communism and is reluctant to oppose it. There is the question of so-called anti-Semitism, which is really a question of anti-communism. My friends, you are invited to write to me directly for a gift copy of this afternoon's address, with which I will be glad to supply you. Believe me, I shall be honored if you request of me this copy. I ask you, was that the most un-American speech you ever heard? Was it a pack of lies, as one prominent rabbi maintained? Am I a supporter of Nazism, which charge was printed by the Detroit Times? Oh, if it is un-American to bestow sympathy for persecuted Christians, I plead guilty. If I'm an advocate of Nazism when I decry communism, I plead guilty. And if I have no argument to offer you to disprove that I'm a sadist, then I humbly bow before the charge and rest my case before the kindly tribunal of this audience. Ladies and gentlemen, you are the judge and the jury. I am the defendant. Truth, crushed to earth, shall rise again. You are welcome to write to me directly for a copy of this discourse.
You are earnestly requested to write in for copies of this afternoon's presentation. Arm yourself with a copy in order to be able to refute whole cloth allegations. Write directly to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan. Until next Sunday afternoon, this is your announcer, Franklin Mitchell, on behalf of Father Coughlin, wishing you good afternoon.
We've presented the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan. The thoughts contained in this address were entirely those of the speaker and in no way affect the policies of this station. Your announcer, Winfield Beck. Your dial is set at 1250. WHBI, Hoyt Brothers Incorporated, Newark, New Jersey.